Hey everyone, welcome back. It's me, the Inner Nerd. In this video I'm going to be making a new kit that I've been wanting to build ever since it came out in 2019, Kinetic's F-104 Starfighter. And because this is a new kit, I'm going to build it straight from the box so you can see what you get in the kit without adding any more detail or replacing bits and pieces. I think this is a good thing because a quick look over the sprues shows that all the parts are nice and detailed. If you like what you're seeing so far, then hit that subscribe button because I upload videos every time I finish one. But videos will be uploaded on a Friday, so make sure you hit that bell icon and get notified when the uploads go live. You get 4 main sprues with the kit, and you get some nice PE parts for the seatbelts and other exterior bits. And the decals are really clear, offering 4 Luftwaffe versions for the aircraft. I did decide to swap out the main decal schemes for some aftermarket ones from extra decal. I really like the 104 in US Air Force Vietnam scheme, so I'll be making a Belgian aircraft which use the same camouflage pattern and colouring. Like with most aircraft kits, the instructions start with the cockpit. I only part assembled the cockpit so I could get around with it with an airbrush more easily. The fit was good enough to attach the back panel after this so I could access all the recesses first before closing it all in. I attached the PE seat belts but left them suspended so I could get to the cushion and paint it without them getting in the way. There are some ejector pin marks on the inside of the exhaust, so I scraped those away with a scalpel blade just enough to make them out of sight. Then did the same on the intakes and sanded them smooth. I thought it'd be a good idea to use the front landing gear bay as a jig for the leg. That allowed me to fix the suspension struts in the right place so they could be painted in position and get a better bond between the plastic parts. Now I know I said I wasn't going to do any more detailing on the kit, but I lied. I drilled some holes to add a little more detail into the gear bay because these weren't punched through in the mould. The flaps are posable, either in the retracted or extended position. Most of the references I was using showed them down, so I cut off the tabs that weren't needed. At this point, I wasn't sure whether I was fitting the outboard fuel tanks, so I painted those separate. A nice tip in painting these is to drill a small hole in the connection point so a toothpick can slide in. That'll allow the part to be secure when painting, and the holes will be invisible once it's assembled. With all the sub-assemblies complete, I move to the primer. I prime each piece with Mr. Surfacer and use black or white depending on the final colour. Then based all the cockpit pieces in ocean grey to get the bluey grey base colour to work on. And then picked out the details by hand using a brush with black and white. I always struggle to pick out the smallest details in the cockpit neatly, so I tried using a toothpick to blob a small amount of paint onto the switches, and I think it turned out better. Whilst the seatbelts were out of the way, I painted the cushions in dark green. And then fixed them down and painted with medium grey. Then highlighted the buckles with silver. The front gear bay was also painted in ocean grey, and the details picked out by hand using mahogany brown and black. The landing gear legs are the same colour as the underside on this scheme, so I painted these in light grey over the white primer, along with the bay doors both front and back. After painting, I realised the quite significant hydraulic type tube was missing, so I added this with some 0.3mm solder wire, which was fixed with superglue. Then painted this in with white paint by hand. To seal the base colour in, I used semi-gloss acrylic varnish ready for the weathering. Just one coat of this will do to protect the paint and give an even surface finish. Next up was to use a wash. I used Ammo's neutral brown to create some subtle dirt and shadows in the floor of the cockpit tub and the gear bay doors. Then to give a bit more contrast on the darker parts, I use Ammo's neutral wash to highlight and give a dusty texture to the recesses and details. I do this on the upward facing parts that would hold dust, like the top of the seat and heads up display covering behind the windscreen. I leave those just to go touch dry, and after around 10 minutes I remove with a dry cotton bud. Some of the tighter areas needed some extra help using a fine brush damping with enamel thinner. The switches looked a bit flat, so I highlighted them using a medium grey oil and dry brushed over the area to pick out the tips. Next I worked on detailing the landing gear. I mixed a grimy colour from oil paints and thinned with enamel thinner to make a wash, then flicked this off a brush using a toothpick to create splatters of hydraulic and brake fluid around the top of the gear leg. The final subassembly was the exhaust. There are a lot of different tones in the exhaust, so I first based over the black primer using dark grey. This colour is basically the same as NATO black, and is slightly lighter than absolute black. I also sprayed the intake while I was at it. Then I used one of my favourite techniques. This is a homemade splatter mask made from a kitchen scouring pad and can act as a random splatter template. I spray a heavily thin medium blue-grey over the mask to get random splatters of lighter paint on the base colour. Using a lighter grey again, you can achieve some nice tonal variation inside the exhaust that replicates soot and burnt metal. With all the painting, detailing and weathering complete, it was time to assemble the cockpit. The fit of the cockpit was great. The ejector seat was a bit of a faff, but once I got it to fit, it located in nice. And then once all the sub-assemblies were installed, it was time to close the fuselage. No issues here, just take care to align everything up along the length. This rear canopy section wasn't the smartest of fits. The electronics bay was causing an interference underneath, so I had to cut this away. After that it fit down nicely. There wasn't really any need for filler on the assembly other than around the intakes. For some reason the moulding is slightly out around this area. I used Deluxe Materials Perfect Plastic Putty because you can apply it and leave it to dry before removing the excess with a damp cotton bud. I masked off the inside of the clear parts using Tamiya tape that are cut into shape. To make these shapes I used the outside as a template for the mask. I used a technical pencil to make the edges of the window and then cut it out and apply to the inside of the canopy as a pre-cut shape. For the clear parts I use super glue to fix them securely. It's easier to decant a small drop of the glue and apply it using a toothpick. If you split the end of the toothpick it'll also act as a fountain pen so you can control the amount and application better. To seal any gaps around the clear parts I use Kristal Klear, which is a white glue. This doesn't affect the clear parts and can be wiped away with a damp cotton bud, so it acts like a filler without the need of any sanding. You might notice that I've not fitted the ejector seat before the canopy. Surprisingly this wasn't one of my usual errors, but the seat sits too high for the canopy to be closed with it installed. The reason why I've attached the canopy will become a little clearer later on. To prep the surface for the paint I sanded with 2000 grit sanding sponge. This removes any small scratches made by the build and finishes the model nice and smooth. A bit of rescribing was needed in some places, so I touched these in with a metal rescribing template and rescribing pin. So back to the canopy. From the box it seems to have this texture on it. It feels smooth to the touch but looks slightly textured when it catches the light. Luckily it's on the outside, so I'm sanding this along with the rest of the model with 2000 and then 3000 grit sanding sponge. To get the canopy restored back to the full shine, I used Tamiya polishing compounds and a buffing pad to polish the parts back to clear. I used the Proxon Micromot along with a power adapter. If you're thinking about buying one of these you'll need the power adapter as well, because the handheld tool is just a pin socket. So then I go through the different compounds from coarse, fine and finish until the canopy is back to clear again. Now it's time for the primer. I use Mr. Surfacer Thin with levelling thinner to around 50%. I thin the surfacer quite a lot so it doesn't build up a frosting on the overspray areas. I also lay this on reasonably wet so that the levelling properties of the thinner can dry nice and flat. Despite being thin, some areas of the primer can dry rough, so I sanded these smooth with 2000 grit sanding sponge. Since this is a 3-tone camouflage, I start off with the lightest colour first. I use Mr. Colour Brown, again thin with levelling thinner to lay down a marble coat. I use the marble coat to get an uneven distribution of paint on the model surface. This breaks up the colour slightly and gives the surface more depth. If you'd like to understand this technique in a load more detail, take a look at my Patreon page where I have exclusive videos explaining some of the techniques I use. First marble layer complete, I blend the colours using the same mix of paint to unify the surface slightly and make the paint layer less transparent. Next up I use the lightest of the greens. I sprayed this in the same way as the brown, using a marble layer to break up the texture on the surface. Since this is a soft edge camouflage, I spray this freehand using the pencil lines as a guide. I'm going to fix the air brakes to the slightly open position, so to get the camouflage patterns correct, I temporarily attached them to spray on the colour. Again, after the first marble layer was complete, I blended the colour together with the same mix of paint using an even spray pattern. Last up was the darkest green. I did exactly the same method as the previous colours, using a marble layer to break up the tones and then blended together with an even layer at the end. The final result is barely visible on camera, but in reality there are thousands of tiny variations of the colours in the paint, and they give the surface a slightly uneven tone. So then it was time for the underside. Now, since I've been so neat on the camouflage colour, I must have thought I was some sort of airbrushing sensation, because I tried to freehand that too, but it didn't work. So to get a nice wavy line, I masked off the area with blue tack. I'd stretched out the blue tack into a long thin sausages, and then covered the rest with cling film to save on tape. Then I marbled the base layer and blended the colours just like on the upper surfaces using the light grey colour. With the main camouflage completed, it was time to detail some of the other bits and pieces. I started with the exhaust by priming it gloss black and then basing with Alclad steel. I turned the airbrush pressure down using these metal paints to just 8 psi, as I get better results working at the lower pressure. With the base layer of steel down, it was time to concentrate on all the heat staining around the petals. I started by adding highlights using aluminium sprayed through my homemade splatter mask to create random pockets of brighter metal. To get some goldy yellow tones, I used pale burnt metal applied in the same way. After that, a really small amount of copper to get the oranges into the mix before finishing it off with some clear blue to create the heat stains. Last job was to add some exhaust soot using heavily thin NATO black. The main landing gear bay had a lot of hydraulic line detail. Picking this detail out was quite tough with a brush, so I used a toothpick and dipped it in paint like I did on the switches in the cockpit. It wasn't entirely foolproof, but it turned out quite good compared to what I was able to do with a brush. With all the main painting complete, it was time to seal in the work using Super Clear 3 gloss varnish. Like with the surfacer, I thin this to around 50% to reduce the risk of frosting in the oversprayed areas. Sometimes the thinners can be quite aggressive against the paintwork, so I lay down 2 mist coats before applying the wet coats and building up the layers. I build up 3 layers, waiting around 45 minutes between each coat, and then 24 hours before applying the decals. The extra decal sheet I bought as an aftermarket didn't have any of the stencils, so I had to use the one supplied with the kit to create the stencil data. Luckily there weren't many differences other than that some may be in the wrong language. Both sets of decals were great and went down really well using Tamiya Mark Fit Strong. After the decals were complete, I sealed those in with Super Clear 3 gloss varnish again, in 3 layers just like with the paint. Even though the decals are really thin from the aftermarket set and the ones from the box, they still witness on the model surface. To get rid of this I sand down the surface using 2000 and 3000 grit sanding sponge until the decals sit level and the surface is smooth. The surface is now more of a satin finish, but this is perfect for the following weathering techniques. So I was looking around for some photo inspiration to weather this jet. I found a few interesting photos. I probably won't go this far, but some of the service jets really do get mucked up, particularly on the lighter colours of the camouflage and on the underside. If you want to take a look at my full list of references, they're linked in the description and might become useful if you're going to make this model for yourself. I started the weathering by mixing my own wash from Winsor & Newton raw Umber oil colour. This wash is mixed with white spirit enamel thinner into a watery consistency. I keep this colour local to the brown areas as these seem to be the most weathered when looking at the references. Also the brown wash ties in with this colour of the camouflage and will be less stark than using a generic black wash over the entire thing. The thing I have against using a black wash is that it accentuates the panel lines too much. Black is the colour that we think we see when we look into a dark area, but in reality it's usually a really dark blue or brown. So by using a slightly blue or brown colour, it will add a bit more realism and depth to the paint finish. So by using the brown I'm sticking with the colours on the model so that the panel lines don't stick out more than they should. Next I mix the dark green oil wash from the black and olive green oil paints, using the white spirit as an enamel thinner. Then I applied this to the lightest of the greens using the same technique as the brown. Once I've finished applying the oil wash, I'll leave it until it's touch dry and then remove with a dry paper towel. Because the surface has a satin finish, some of the oils get left behind. If it was on a full gloss finish, more of the oil would be removed with a paper towel, but I didn't want that because the brown would stain the surrounding area. I didn't make an oil wash for the darkest green because looking at the references the panel lines in these areas were not a darker colour, so instead moved straight to the underside. I mixed the dark greeny colour from black, brown and green oils and thinned again with white spirit until a wash consistency. Then just like on the top side, highlighted the panel lines with a wash, waited until touch dry and removed with a dry paper towel. Before I went any further with the weathering, I sealed in the oil washes with flat acrylic varnish from Tamiya. Because the next stages are also oil based, we need to seal in the panel line wash so we don't remove it in the following steps. The matte varnish will also help the oil stick to the surface so we can create some nice streaking and staining. Now I use raw oil paints which aren't thinned at all. I start by using raw umber colour to create some stains on the brown areas of the camouflage. Then to blend those in, I use white spirit enamel thinner and blend the oils directly on the model. I prefer to use a stippling motion with a pointed brush to dissipate the oil around the edge of the panel. This will make the oils bleed into the paint and create the stains. To make the streaks, I grab a flat brush dampened with enamel thinner and drag the oils along the panel. This may take several passes due to how little pressure is needed to spread the oil, but eventually the streaks will be thin and transparent enough to look genuine. After the blending is complete, there can be sometimes a residue left around the edge of the oil. I use a dry stipple brush to blend this into the surrounding panels and create a uniform surface. I repeat this step with the raw oils, using a darker green for the green areas of the camouflage, and blend those in using the same method. It's better to go light with the thinners at this stage so you don't drown the area that you want to blend. A damp brush is more than enough to start manipulating the oils around the area you're focusing on. Next I add some bleaching in the form of highlights to removable panels on the spine. I mixed a slightly lighter tone of the brown from oils and then applied them as a dot filter onto the access hatches. Because I wanted these as a smooth highlight, I didn't use any enamel thinners but went straight in with a dry stippling brush and blended those into the surrounding colour. Now back to the underside. I noticed on a few reference images I was using that there were a lot of streaks and stains, particularly under the wings and exhaust. I started the staining using Ammo's neutral wash and applied underneath the exhaust area. I completely covered the panels so that the oil could be blended in to create some dense staining. Then once that was dry, I used the stippling brush from before, which was dampened with enamel thinner, and used the stippling motion to create an uneven blend of the colour. This makes quite a choppy blend, which is good to replicate the collection of dirt. I tried to keep most of the work inside the panel, but blend the outer edges by creating streaks with a flat brush, which is once again dampened with enamel thinner. This creates the effect of running rain marks. To add some streaks I created like a brown grey tone and applied using a pointed brush. I tried to apply the streaks as close to the finished product as I could, and then gently manipulated with the brush, dampened with enamel thinner, to finish and fade the edges slightly. I added some more streaks in a slightly more earth or grease colour to create some depth and generate different types of leaks. I noticed that around antennas and aerials, rain streaks had cleaned away some of the dirt. I replicated this by using a toothpick to scratch away some of the oil wash, showing the light grey underneath. The fin and arrestor hook promise some interesting weathering. I'd already based the bare metal of the fin in steel and sealed in at the varnish stage. I added some depth to the steel plate using dark grey oil mix to build up that texture. To add the rust I used medium rust wash from AK. To copy the reference image I added this just to the bottom of the fin. This laid down the base of the rust and will act like a roadmap for the following effects. Next up I used the light rust wash and picked out some of the brighter areas. These washes don't take long to dry, so I used a pointed brush dampened with enamel thinner to blend in the effects. The blending was still quite sharp, so I used a dry stippling brush to soften the edges slightly. Then I moved back to some more local weathering, using a very dark brown to pick out what looks like damp areas along the panel gaps. I applied and blended these in exactly the same way as I did before. Taking a look back at the reference photos, I saw quite a lot of chipping around some of the access panels. To replicate this I made a medium grey colour from oils, and then applied with a pointed brush along the panel edges. For the more fine chips I used a Derwent watercolour pencil in slate grey and added some chips around the access panels. To make the chips seem more genuine, I concentrated around the edge of the panel and also on the rivets. I also used a lighter green in some areas to show that some chips were superficial and didn't go all the way through to the primer. The external drop tank seemed to get quite a lot of Rainmark weathering. I applied a dot filter with a light and dark coloured oil wash, and then blended these in with a flat brush dampened with enamel thinner by stroking the oil downwards to replicate the rain drips. Again, like with the streaking on the fuselage, this may take a couple of passes to blend them in enough. I couldn't decide on the colour of the external fuel tanks. I'd seen a few pictures of the bright orange version like in the photo, but I decided to put it up to a public vote on my Instagram. The orange version won by a considerable margin, so that's what I'm going to do. I got the fluorescent orange paint from Mr. Colour and sprayed this over a grey primer base. I used a grey primer instead of white because I wanted to tone down the orange just a little bit, since, well, it was quite bright. The markings on the orange tank seemed to be a little different to that on the camouflage ones, so I had to steal some decals that I had left over from my Phantom build, and also some others to get the markings looking right. I didn't want to weather these too much, so I mixed a dark orange wash from oil paints and then applied it just on the panel lines to give the tank some depth. To make a quick mask for the wheels, I used my scribing template to cover the tyres so that I could spray the hubs without the need to mask them off. I always start with the undercarriage so that the model can stand under its own weight, and then move on to the pylons and payload. PVA glue so that they could be removed if I wanted to replace them with sidewinders, but the rest of the final assembly was done using superglue. I added the seat back in by opening up the canopy and breaking the seal of the white glue. This came off quite easy and clean because the white glue isn't that strong. Then I refitted the canopy with superglue in the open position. The final part is the pitot tube and the model was complete. So that's it, Kinetic's F-104 Starfighter. A really nice kit and fantastic detail straight from the box. It's definitely one that I would make again sometime in the future because these things look so good in other colour schemes too. If you think that I should build another one, let me know in the comments below and what camouflage scheme I should do that one in. Remember, if you like what you saw, then hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. The more subscribers we get means one step closer to getting these videos on a more regular basis. If you want to speed that up even further, head over to my Patreon page and join the others and get some exclusive content like product and technique masterclass videos, where I really break down every step I take to make a model like this. The link to my Patreon page is at the end of the video and linked in the description too. As always, thank you very much for watching and I'll see you in the next one. like to take a moment to give a shout out to my Patreon supporters, which really help me along with making this channel improve and deliver more and more interesting content. If you enjoyed this video, give me a like and subscribe to see my latest uploads. And if you want to support my channel, go visit my Patreon page, which is linked at the top of the screen, or jump straight into more videos like this through one of my playlists. And see some behind the scenes on my Instagram, theinnernerd_insta.